All right, welcome everybody. My name is Peter Loge. I'm the director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication at the George Washington University. Welcome to today's conversation, Beyond the Beltway, Young Advocates Finding Common Ground. A reminder that we're recording this. It's going to live online forever, or as long as the internet lasts, I guess. So I'll be emailing around a link to the recording to everybody who registered for the event shortly. I'll introduce my guests in a moment, but first a bit about the Project on Ethics and Political Communication. Here at the Project, we promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. There's a time when rhetoric, ethics, politics, philosophy, governance, political science were all the same field. We've drifted apart, and I think it's time for us to drift back together. The project does things like host conversations like this. I edited a book on political communication ethics, both in theory and in practice. We've worked on case studies, about real-world, classroom-ready case studies with the University of Texas at Austin. We host digital conversations, have a 5-question series, speak to the press, give talks around the country and around the world to corporations, lobbying firms, colleges, universities, and pretty much anybody else who will be willing to listen to us talk. You'll hear more about us. We'd love to hear more from you. But today, I am really excited to join our guests for what I think is going to be a super interesting conversation. We'll get to them in a second, but you should know these video conversations have had current and former members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, former Secretary of Agriculture joined us. At one point, we've had senior operatives, we've had journalists, we've had senior academics. I am probably most excited for today's conversation with a couple of high school students. David Chen and Calder Law. I'll let them introduce themselves, but I do need to set them up. They are friends, classmates at school in San Francisco from opposite ends of the political spectrum who've come together to create, I think, a really cool and kind of remarkable organization that works across the aisle to promote partisan, but also good, sound politics. So we're going to talk to them, let them introduce themselves in a moment. We're going to talk to them a bit about some of the ethical challenges, how they're facing it, and how they view a politics which looks much different to them than it did to me when I was in high school in Connecticut in the 1980s. So David Calder, who are you? Tell us about yourselves and what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Peter, for having us on. We're really excited to be here and honored to be, I think, the youngest guests of your series so far. Um, I'm Calder. I'm a sophomore in high school here in San Francisco, and I'm a Democrat because, I believe in the power that I think anybody should be able to rise to achieve their American dream here in America.
Yeah, so I'm David. I'm also a sophomore in high school here in San Francisco, and I'm a Republican because I believe in individual liberty, and I've seen the effects of hyper liberal policies here in San Francisco.
And so we run two different organizations. We run Youth for Common Sense PAC, which is our political action committee focused around bipartisanship and trying to promote bipartisanship and reaching across difference in the House of Representatives. And so we fund candidates from both the Democrat and Republican side, both in equal amounts, to try and get more people talking to each other, try and get more actionable and real change in Congress instead of just the partisan bickering that we've had. And then we also run our nonprofit, which is called Youth for Common Sense Ed Fund, which is dedicated to the pursuit of trying to get high schoolers involved. So it's a grassroots organization trying to depolarize our generation and depolarize many of the people who may not yet be politically engaged, but are coming onto the spectrum and beginning to learn about their political beliefs.
And so we'll share links to both the PAC and the nonprofit when I email around the link to the video or to the recording realistically tomorrow. How and why did you start this?
Yeah, so we initially founded Youth for Common Sense after, we were just talking about, politics, and we became really dismayed with kind of how polarized our political environment was. And we were looking around and said, okay, well, like, what can we do about this? And so we initially founded the Youth for Common Sense PAC to try and make change and bring people closer together from across the aisle in Congress. And through that, we realized, well, it's great to be able to contribute to candidates and make change in Congress. It's pretty difficult to make actual like concrete change in Congress. And so we realized that like where we can make the most change and have the most impact is with people our own age. And that's why we started the Youth for Common Sense nonprofit or education fund, which kind of helps bring people together, bring high schoolers together from across the political spectrum to talk with each other and discuss different issues.
Yeah, I mean, we really founded the nonprofit because we believe when you're in high school is a pivotal moment in your life, both, around your life, but also in your political side, because, for your early childhood, you're mostly just experiencing politics through the way your family experiences it, through the way your community experiences it. But in high school, people start to get exposure to a lot of different things, especially right now with social media and the internet. You're beginning to learn more about your political beliefs. And so this is just such a key time in people's lives for them to reach out and get outside of the echo chamber that they might be living in, and to hear from people who may think differently than they do, and kind of challenge their own political beliefs. And so that when they become adults and when they're voting, they can also see the humanity and they can see the person behind somebody from a different side of the aisle.
Super important to do. It's easy to say, but you guys are actually doing it. I went to a fundraiser you all hosted here in Washington, D.C. Who have you endorsed?
Yeah, so we've endorsed a bunch of candidates in the House. Some of them include Representative Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania 1, Jared Golden, Tony Gonzalez, Don Samuels, Don Davis, Lori Chavez DeRemer, who's now the Secretary of Labor, Murray Gluesenkamp Perez, and a bunch of others. So, we've given to candidates, our philosophy is we want to give to both 50% Democrats and 50% Republicans. And so we've kept with that throughout giving this cycle.
So this sounds optimistic, right? If you give to candidates, that means you think things can change. You're talking about engaging high school students, getting them as they form their political beliefs to be passionate about their beliefs, but not crazy partisans who hate people, right? I got to tell you, though, from Washington, D.C., it can feel pretty pessimistic in politics right now. I talked to some of my students here at GW feeling pretty pessimistic. Why are you optimistic about politics and partisan politics in this country?
I personally think that with social media, while it has a lot of downsides, like it makes it very easy for anybody to spread any sort of message. And while that's kind of a double-edged sword, it's really helpful for us to be able to kind of spread our message and help people try to come to the middle.
I also think more broadly, like, part of what we're doing is we're trying to say, hey, we recognize that in this political moment, we're as far apart as we've ever been, and we're, going farther apart. But if we can meet youth where they're at, if we can meet high schoolers and college students, those people are going to take what we're telling them and what they're learning and what they're engaging. And we've heard a lot of really positive things from them, and then take that throughout the rest of their life. So, while we might be in the most polarized moment right now, I think over time, my hope is, and what we're really passionate about here at Youth for Common Sense, is that we're going to be able to begin coming closer together, not spreading farther apart.
So how do you then make your decisions about who to support?
Yeah, so initially we looked at the Lugar Center's bipartisan index, which ranks different politicians from most bipartisan to least bipartisan and gives them a score. But we also just looked at people who were candidates who were running against people who we thought were kind of really far from the center. For example, Tony Gonzalez was running against Brandon Herrera, who is a far-right gun rights activist.
Yeah, and I mean, right in that example, it was somebody who's just trying to create as much attention as possible, and was kind of their whole platform was, hey, I'm going to come to Congress and create a bunch of trouble, but I'm not actually going to try and get anything done and come to the table. And so we really prioritize candidates who are saying, look, I'm coming to Congress and I have my own beliefs. I'm still a partisan. I'm still on whatever side of the aisle, but I firmly believe that we have to come to the table, and we need to figure out how we're going to get things done, because nothing in Congress gets done by you just shoving it through. Very rarely it gets done by you just shoving it through. So we funded people like Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, who was running against Joe Kent, who was a member of, pretty far on the right with ties to the Proud Boys and other organizations, versus somebody who had come to Congress and was really trying to get things done. So, we looked at a lot of candidates, especially in primaries, who were people who either were coming in to try and challenge somebody who was being a performative politician, or somebody who was, in Congress trying to get things done, being challenged by somebody who was just kind of trying to create a ruckus.
So it was a question in the chat, I think, gets to some of what you're talking about. So one of the things I'm hearing is you want a politics that works, right? That actually functions, we can get stuff done. That may or may not be an ethical standard, right? Success may or may not be an ethical standard. You might want to, some people might say the ethical action is to be extreme, to hold your pure values. So are there ethical standards to which you hold yourselves, or to which you hold your candidates? What are the role of ethics in your own politics and in your decision making as running the nonprofit and running the PAC?
I mean, I think it's really hard because, and I honestly don't think we've fully come to an answer yet around that. But something that we think a lot about is, people can't just continue to stay in their own echo chambers and stay either on the left or the right and never come and talk to each other, because we just fundamentally don't live in a system where that works. Our democracy requires us to come together and work together. And so, we're holding our candidates to the standard of, hey, are you trying and, working on your best to try and get things done and to try and create actionable change? But ultimately, it's really hard because, in some ways, as you just mentioned, people would say, oh, it's, the most pure form of your ethics to just stay on your side. But I think, in order to solve all of the problems that we have in America and just continue to create a more perfect union, we've got to come to the decision table together and say, hey, how are we going to put our heads together and create a solution that works for everybody and something that can actually get passed in Congress?
Yeah, and just to add to that, like, it's not necessarily that, we have to all come together and agree, but we have to at least be willing to kind of sit down and talk to each other and try to at least discuss what we think might be the best solution moving forward.
I mean, here you're echoing a lot of what our founders wrote. Alexander Hamilton, before he was famous for his musical, was something of a political philosopher. And in the first Federalist paper, he talks about the dangers of partisanship and the fact that partisans on your side might also be, not the best people just because they happen to agree with you. And those who disagree with you can often be good people, even if they're on the other side of a policy debate. So here, you're really sort of echoing a lot of early themes of America's founding documents. Somebody, when they registered for the event, I'm not going to call anybody out without their permission, but asked, I think, a really fundamental question is, where do your ethics come from, right? You're really young, as you know, and you keep being told, and you've got a pretty firm set of political convictions. What drives your ethics? What drives your political convictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, initially, especially when I was younger, my kind of values and political beliefs came from my parents. And while that's still partially true, I think it's now developed a lot more into kind of, reading the news, being involved with what happens, and just kind of my own personal experiences.
I think something that, we've noticed a lot with our nonprofit, something that we work a lot on is, people come to high school largely having the ethical beliefs and the ethic and the just political convictions that you have when you're a young kid. And as I mentioned earlier, high school is this really great time when you're able to experiment and think about, what do I believe in? What actually matters to me? And it's something that we've thought a lot about because, I think, David and I have had a lot of hard conversations about politics throughout our time, and we continue to sharpen our political beliefs through that. But it is hard because I think, people their ethics continue to evolve over time. I don't think anybody here can admit, and I certainly can't admit, that my ethics are going to be the most perfect form of ethics that there have ever been. And so, we are constantly evolving, and I think our organization and the people in it will continue to have those conversations, and some of them will be really hard conversations, but we're going to continue to work to try and get people to reach out and continue to justify their political beliefs.
So it sounds like one of the ethical principles from which you operate is listening and at some level humility, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people come into politics because they're certain they have the right answer to the right thing, and they spend a lot of time shouting at people how right they are. But it sounds like one of the things you're saying is that people have to be willing to admit they're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have to be willing to come to the table. And they have to, we said that so many times during this, but people really got to be able to listen to each other, and they've got to at least hear out what the other side has to say. And yeah, that does require sometimes you're going to hear an argument and you're going to be like, hey, I actually agree with that more than I agree with my previous conviction. And so, sometimes that's going to change. Sometimes it's going to stay the same. But it's important that we come to those conversations and we come to life in general with the perspective of, I'm going to hear out the argument, and sometimes I'm going to agree and sometimes I'm going to disagree, but I'm going to commit myself to at least fully understanding and hearing out their argument.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit with that, but you set me up for it, so I'm going to take advantage of it. Have have either of you changed the other's mind on a policy?
I think, something that David and I talked about a good bit last year was foreign aid funding, specifically funding for Ukraine. In our newsletter that we sent out in our pack this fall, we had this section called Middle Ground, where we took somebody in our team would write a Democrat perspective and somebody would write a Republican perspective, and then they would come together and agree on what they thought the middle ground was in the issue. And David and I both wrote, I wrote the Democrat, he wrote the Republican's perspective on foreign aid funding and specifically funding for Ukraine. And I think I initially was from the perspective that, we need to give as much as possible because that's good for our national security. But I think David did bring up some really great points and definitely helped me create a more nuanced perspective to where I now, still, I think largely believe that to be true, but also am holding the fact that maybe we should be spending our dollars on our troops.
So, David, you're apparently very persuasive. Has Calder persuaded you to change your mind on anything or become
Yeah,
more
I mean,
nuanced in your views?
I think Calder, I mean, for on a number of things, he's kind of led me to have a more nuanced perspective, like you said. But I think particularly with immigration, I think that was another kind of topic we had when we were writing Middle Ground for the pack. And specifically for immigration, while previously I definitely had the perspective of like, oh, the border's pretty dangerous. We like a lot of, there's a lot of dangers associated with like the security of the border. And while I still largely hold the same overarching belief, just like, Calder, I think I'm now kind of keeping in mind that like, oh, a lot of these immigrants might not have anywhere else to go. And like a lot of these people are genuinely like coming to the US looking for a job or something like that.
Interesting. Interesting. All right, I'm going to change gears a little bit. Pam asks a question in the chat that echoes a constant question in politics, and that's the means and the ends. And I want to put it specifically in the context of a philosophical sort of thought experiment called the dirty hands problem. And it's how dirty do you get your hands, right? And the thought experiment is you're running for city council, maybe in San Francisco, maybe somewhere else, and you're honest and you're good and you're pure. You're running for the right reasons. You're not corrupt. You're ethical. You're everything that you want your candidates to be. The person running against you is incredibly corrupt. They're selfish. They're venal. They're just a bad person we want out of politics. Campaign is super close. Somebody comes to you, a major developer comes to you and says, look, I think you're a better person. I'd like to see you elected. And I can write a really big check to help you get over the finish line. But if I do that, and if you win, I want first dibs at a contract for building a new school. So I will help you get elected, and you can do the right things for the right reasons if you let me cheat once. If you don't say yes, I'll help the other guy win. And so the other guy would be all bad all the time. You'd be mostly good most of the time. What do you do? Do you take the deal? Do the ends of better governance on balance justify the means of cheating a little bit? Or if you're ethical or not, right? You can't be a little bit ethical. You're fully ethical or aren't. So what do you do in a situation like that?
I mean, I think it's a slippery slope. The first thing that I would bring up is like, you know, I think most people in politics come to politics trying to do good, trying to help our country or help their city. Um, but it's just such a slippery slope because, maybe you do it the first time and you win election, but then you're looking to run for state senate. And the same developer comes to you and says, if you help us build the new courthouse, then I'll help you get elected. And I do think it is just such a slippery slope because, it's so easy to say, well, I'm trying to do something good, and so I'm gonna just continue to take money. But at what point have you become that other politician? Because, in the world that we live in, and as we talked about with our PAC, it requires a lot of money to affect a lot change in Congress, and to win elected office a lot of the time. And so a big concern that I have is, at what point have you become that second politician?
So, David, how do you prevent becoming that second politician? How do you stay true to your ethics while also getting stuff done?
I mean, I think a part of it, like, is not going down the slippery slope in the first place. And obviously, while it could definitely be beneficial to, take that money and just give the contract for the school, I think, like, yeah, like Caller said, it's a really slippery slope. And even if it's so easy to say, oh, like, I'll just this one time, like, I'll take this and give the developer the contract. But then, maybe you're running for re-election or a higher office or something like that, where at some point you just have to not get on the slippery slope at all.
Interesting. It's a tough question. It's a tough question. I'm going to change gears a little bit because we're running out of time here. Somebody else who registered asked, by all ages, are there ways that perspectives of youth might be overvalued or undervalued? Are you being taken too seriously as young voters or not seriously enough? And how do you make sure you're heard through the clutter?
I mean, I personally think there's a pretty fine line between kind of being heard too much and not enough. I think there's a little bit of both today. I think while sometimes we might, on our youth's opinions might be undervalued, because we're younger, we have less experience, and might not necessarily know what we're doing as much. But I think in that sense, it's also undervalued because of our kind of lack of experience and because we're kind of on the outside, look, and we don't have that we haven't started down that slippery slope, essentially.
Yeah, I think something that I think about a lot is, a lot of people often will say, oh, hey, let's get youth involved, but let's like not really get youth involved. Let's just have them as the token voice there. Or, say, oh my God, what you're doing is so great, but, we're not actually really want you to get involved with anything. We just kind of want you to be there because it looks good on our website or it looks good on whatever our or on a social media post. And so but I do think, youth, especially right now, have so much power. And as we've seen in this last election, really do have the ability to change elections and change the way that our country is running. And so I think you've got to take into account the youth vote, and you've got to really think about, hey, how are the people that are not even of the age to vote yet, but are beginning to develop their political beliefs, how are they going to affect our country, and how are we working with them to try and create a better future for all of us?
That makes sense. That makes sense. So politicians respond to incentives, and one set of incentives is voters or volunteers or money, and you've got the money piece, you're getting volunteers, you're not quite voting yet, but you will be. How do you persuade other high schools? This isn't just a local thing. This isn't just you guys, right? You're trying to build a national movement. How do you persuade high school students across the country that the politics matters, that it's relevant, and that they can play a role?
I mean, I think it's really that, like, just showing high schoolers that like while this might not matter to you now or affect you now, it will become a pretty big part of your life in the future.
I think something that we've noticed a lot is I don't want to call it the low propensity high schooler, but it's the person who is, not that engaged in politics, listens to, the occasional comment, or reads the occasional article, sees the occasional social media post. So many of those people that we've talked to agree with what we're doing and don't want to fall into this trap where they simply live in their own echo chamber, but also, have a million other things going on. High schoolers are really, really busy people. And so something that we continue to work on is how can we engage people who are, not super involved in politics already, not super involved in reading the news or staying super up to date, but really love what we're doing. And I'm going to tell you, Peter, it's still a challenge and we're still trying to figure it out. It's really hard because those people are ultimately the people that are going to be driving our elections in the future and are going to be the most important factor. But they're also people that, are oftentimes going to be the hardest to reach. And so we spend a lot of time, our team, shout out to them because we think about this question a lot, like how do we reach out to people who are not going to be the easiest to reach, but still agree with what we're doing?
It is a tough challenge. I've been working in politics for a long time. I started volunteering in politics when I was also quite young, too young to vote. And the sort of a rule of thumb is the young voters will decide the next election, and it's always one election away from the one that they will decide. So hopefully you can make a bit of a difference. Hopefully you can have success where so many others have not. And I'm confident that you're doing it in different ways and more interesting ways than your predecessors. So you might have solved the puzzle. We're just about at time. And I know you guys have things like lunch and class to get to. What parting thoughts or words do you about ethics or politics or anything else do you want to share?
I mean, I think, as you mentioned earlier in this, I think the future is bright. I think David and I both, and a lot of the high schools that we talk to think the future is bright. It's not going to be an easy future to get to, but it's a future worth investing in. And so, I would highly encourage you to check out our website when Peter sends it out. Check us out on social media at Youth for Common Sense. We're really trying to build something here to get our next generation to not be as polarized and to get out of those echo chambers. And I really think that, if we're able to reach those people who are, the low propensity high schooler, we're going to have a really great future ahead of us.
Thoughts, David?
Yeah, I mean, like Calder said, I think I'm pretty optimistic about future. I think, well, yeah, it's definitely going to take a lot of work to get there and get where we want to be. Maybe 5-10 years from now, I think like I'm definitely optimistic about where we're heading.
Love it. David Calder, thank you so much. Everybody check out it's Youth for Common Sense. I'll email around the link. Get involved if you know high school students or high school teachers, or if you know people who know high school students or high school teachers, tell them to get involved. Right? Political change happens a David and a Calder at a time. Everybody working in politics today was once a high school student doing student government or Model UN or on the debate team or whatever. This is like that, only more so, bigger, faster, stronger, and heaven knows we need it. So, David Calder, thank you again for the time. Thank you for your work. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll follow up soon, and keep at it, guys. Well done, and thanks
Yeah,
everybody
thank you for having us.
Thank you.